You're listening to the Monocle Daily, first broadcast on the 18th of July, 2024 on Monocle Radio.
Donald Trump prepares to address the RNC, but will delegates hear him through their cosmetic ear bandages? The UK hosts a gathering of European leaders like the last 8 years never happened, and Japan does an insufficient amount to discourage the umbrella menace. I'm Andrew Muller. The Monocle Daily starts now. Hello and welcome to the Monocle Daily, coming to you from our studios here at Midori House in London. I'm Andrew Muller. My guests Daniela Peled and Nick Gowing will discuss the day's big stories, and our weekly letter from is a letter from Washington DC. Stay tuned, all that and more coming up right here on the Monocle Daily. This is the Monocle Daily. I'm Andrew Muller, and I am joined today by Daniela Peled, Managing Editor of the Institute for War and Peace Reporting, and by Nick Gowing, Distinguished Fellow at the Royal United Services Institute. Hello to you both.
Hello.
Hello, Andrew.
Daniela, first of all, as regular listeners will be aware, though we are forever introducing you as Managing Editor of the Institute for War and Peace Reporting, and I'm sure you haven't made that up, it will seem to our listeners that you do little with your time than traipse around the country and indeed the world visiting obtuse and obscure local history museums. Which ones have you been to lately?
Extremely accurate. I am planning a trip to the sort of outer reaches of London suburbia this weekend. I shall not reveal where, it's too exciting, but I'll report back. Even more excitingly, next week I'm off to the United States of America. More specifically, homing in on a certain chainsaw museum in Washington State.
Are you travelling all the way to Washington State merely to go to a chainsaw museum? Please tell us the answer is yes.
Well, not just that. I'm also reliably informed that there's a town called Concrete nearby.
There is.
And if that town does not have an eponymous concrete museum, I shall be very disappointed.
Well, the thing is, even if it is a local history museum, it will by definition be a concrete museum. If not necessarily a museum about concrete, it will still be the Museum of Concrete.
I'm guaranteed a happy summer holiday.
It will possibly even be made of concrete. Nick, you have been doing something which I guess is local history museum adjacent. You went on a heritage railway?
I did indeed, with some Australian fans of railways, to a railway I'd never been to before. I'm not a railway fan, but I ended up going to Loughborough and getting on the East Midlands Railway 12-mile heritage railway with a lot of vehicles, a lot of locomotives, which I have to say I remember from my childhood. It was like playing...
This is a steam train kind of thing.
12 miles, double track, with steam coming out of it, and it was totally irresponsible for sustainability and biodiversity. But it was I was saying to myself, how many of the current generation even know what a steam train is and looks like? And there was a vehicle there, a locomotive there, which had been rebuilt in 2008, and it was 140 tons in weight. When you think of the extraordinary demand that must have made on the track. But I'm not a railway freak. It was a great day.
We believe you, Nick. We believe you.
I have to tell you, the trains getting there, both to and from Loughborough, were all late.
Obviously.
So I got compensation for that.
Have you met the United Kingdom in the 21st century? But we will start in the United States, specifically in Milwaukee, the city hosting a Republican National Convention, which now feels like it has been going on since slightly after the arrival of the Mayflower, but which actually only began on Monday. Later tonight, former and perhaps future President Donald Trump will speak. It has been confirmed in the last few hours that before Trump takes the stage, we'll be hearing from Hulk Hogan. Yes, the big in the 80s cartoon blowhard whose bronze-slathered caricature of Machismo has been long beloved by crowds of hooting yokels and who forged a tawdry career, and you know where this is going, tawdry career in tacky reality TV before becoming enmeshed in dismal scandals related to his personal finances and seething bigotry. We'll speak after Hulk Hogan. Daniela, what are we expecting to hear from... I worked all afternoon on that.
You should be proud of yourself.
What are we expecting to hear from Donald Trump?
I'm expecting to hear something approaching, or perhaps his version of being humble.
Come on.
Yeah, I think so. I think he's going to try. I think he's going to fail. But I think, the response to his to the assassination attempt has been, an outpouring of, well, he might be awful, but we're happy he's not dead, which is, I think he's going to be quite surprised by that, by how people have responded. But also, I'm not even sure if he's going to be able to get a word in edgeways with the chanting of USA, USA. And I'm sure you've seen the images of people with their tribute ear bandages.
It is quite weird.
Yeah, people are wearing wearing little big plasters on their ears to symbolise what? I'm not quite sure. If anybody needed any confirmation that this is a cult, I think that is the icing on the cake.
I mean, after 1981, Nick, nobody turned up to hear Ronald Reagan speak with like a little hole poked in their jacket or anything. It is extremely odd behaviour. But do you buy?
That was a different kind of politics.
It was a very different kind of politics. But do you buy any of this stuff, Nick, which has been vaguely floated that somehow Donald Trump, nearly 80, is a changed man?
77.
That's pretty close to 80. But he's a changed man for his experience.
I think he's looked changed. Whether he really has changed, I think he's been shaken. He had a dice with death. He was probably half an inch away from death. I think it's extraordinary. I'm running a project called Thinking the Unthinkable. You could never have written this as a scenario for something which could happen. Not just that, and the way he's appointed J.D. Vance as his running mate, but what has now happened to Biden as well, with Biden saying in an interview with ABC, first of all, if a doctor or someone tells me I've got a problem, then I might consider withdrawing, and then rushing and being cordoned in a Mexican restaurant because he's got COVID and having to fly back to Washington. I mean, this has all the hallmarks of something which you could not have ever imagined, particularly these cartoons, not just the ones you've just described, of Jesus with his hands on Trump, as if there's an anointing going on from up above. And both Biden and Trump have talked about whatever God thinks is right.
Well, it does obviously, not that pointing this out ever does any good, either Jesus or his dad did seem serenely unbothered by what happened to the three other people who got shot. Daniela, J.D. Vance anointed earlier this week as the vice presidential candidate, and again playing a bit into this narrative which they seem to be trying to float of Donald Trump as some sort of grandfatherly unifier. Do you get the impression the idea is that Vance will now do more of the attack dog stuff?
I think he just needs to open his mouth and, attacks come pouring out. Apparently, we are now an Islamist nuclear country.
The United Kingdom,
yep,
that is,
that's
yes.
Right.
That's true.
Which on very unsure and shaky logic, maybe because the mayor of London is a Muslim, I don't know. That seems to be his logic.
My understanding is that the mayor of London is not part of the nuclear chain of command in the United Kingdom, but I'm not an expert.
Yeah, no,
He's
quite
not.
right.
Yeah.
Right, okay. Well, somebody needs to tell the J.D. Vance. He's got a kind of charisma in the way that Donald Trump kind of doesn't. I mean, I read his book.
Really?
I read
all of it.
I read all of his book, and
you
I thought
got further in than I did.
Well, I thought it was a very interesting read, and it also seemed to have like an element of compassion in it for his subjects and those he encounters, which, J.D. Vance, the post-memoir version, has zero compassion for anybody, even people who are pregnant as a result of rape. This seems to be a completely transformed narrative, but it's one that plays pretty well with Trump's. I think it's when you think the Trump narrative is getting a bit dull, maybe, the shooting happens and J.D. Vance comes along and, it's all go again.
Well, it may be all go on the other side of the aisle as well, Nick. You did mention President Biden's diagnosis with COVID, and as an experienced journalist, do you recognise in the stories now starting to leak from within the Democratic circle a somewhat concerted campaign to try and elbow him off the ticket? Reported within the last hour that it has become known somehow that President Obama has told Biden that his moment might have come.
I think we're probably 2 weeks away from him pulling out.
That long?
2 weeks away. Depends which time we're on, I think. But they've got to make a decision before the convention at the end of August. So it's got to happen. And I think it's moving in that direction very rapidly. One has to wonder whether there's been a bringing together of I will take a view if a doctor tells me that I'm not well, and then suddenly he's got COVID. You begin to wonder if there's a degree of message manipulation here.
Is this the construction of a dignified exit?
Exactly. But maybe I'm just being a skeptic. But look, one has to be sceptical. I mean, given what has happened with the Secret Service and the fact that they said for health and safety reasons, their snipers couldn't have gone on the roof where the gunman was aiming at former President Trump. And then you actually saw the pictures of the snipers on a different roof, which was even more acute. And therefore, they could have fallen off that. Her credibility is really rock bottom at the moment as well. She's up in Congress on Monday.
Well, on this shore of the Atlantic, the possible imminent retreat of the United States into swivel-eyed autarky will be a dominant theme of conversation at the fourth summit of the fledgling European political community. The EPC, largely one of French President Emmanuel Macron's big ideas, seems to be at least partly an apparatus for keeping the UK somehow attached to Europe. And the UK's new Prime Minister, Sir Keir Starmer, is hosting the event at what was doubtless felt to be the propitious and auspicious location of Blenheim Palace, birthplace of Winston Churchill. Daniela, this is, as I was just saying, the fourth go-round for the EPC. When it was first floated in 2022, it was, certainly in this country, kind of interpreted as a bit of a prank at the UK's expense by Emmanuel Macron, i.e. I'm going to create this new European community, which you can't possibly refuse to turn up to, ha ha ha, got you. But is it clear to you yet what its purpose is going to be?
Well, yeah, this was the creation of Emmanuel Macron when he was trying to institute a muscular foreign policy, which is not really quite so muscular in any sense now, is he, poor Emmanuel? But it's a talking shop. It's a talking shop. If you believe that talking is good and also talking amongst the leaders and the leadership, then that's pretty beneficial. That's all it is. It has no executive. It has no legal arm. It has no, that's it. It's just a chance for people to get together and chitty chat, which has its value a little bit separate from the pen pushing and the apparatchicness of it. And I believe the next one is going to be hosted by Viktor Orban, which is slightly
something to look forward to,
laughable. Isn't it? Yeah, somebody who's almost as Eurosceptic as Nigel Farage, maybe a bit more. I don't know, but so it kind of. One can't take it super seriously. But Keir Starmer is having a great old time, and certainly in the blush of confidence of a newly elected Prime Minister doing all the messaging, hosting it, Churchill's old seat, and making friends with everyone. And it's true. The Labour government's foreign policy priority, and I think more on their radar than Gaza or Ukraine, is really to build closer ties with the EU and to renew quite creaky and resentful and embarrassing ties that the previous government had.
I mean, Nick, on that relationship building, Sir Keir Starmer does have obviously a panoply of European leaders he could be choosing to spend time with at this thing. He goes out of his way to invite Taoiseach Simon Harris from the Republic of Ireland to Chequers. How significant is that?
Very significant, I think. They drank beer together on the terrace last night. But can I just... Both of you have been quite cynical and sceptical about this. I think it's extraordinary. I'm a former diplomatic editor of Channel 4 News. I think it's extraordinary that 12 days into this new government, or less than 12 days almost, Starmer has had this opportunity with 47 leaders of 47 nations. Ursula von der Leyen wasn't there because she was getting renominated back in Brussels. But to have those kind of people there at a time when the new Labour government with a large majority wants to send a message of we want to engage with Europe at a time of growing weakness economically and also physically and strategically and in defence and in security, I think is an extraordinary bit of good luck. It was all conceived by Rishi Sunak.
Sure.
It was put together by British officials. But to have this happening on a beautiful day, as it happens to be, at a time when all this is happening, to create a new sense of solidity between all these leaders, even if there's a difference with the Italian leader, the Turkish leader,
certainly the Hungarian one.
Yeah, with Orban as well. And this real concern about Viktor Orban having been to Moscow, having been to Mar-a-Lago, and coming up with a new idea of how Ukraine can enter some kind of peace process, which is never going to be accepted by the Ukrainians, certainly under Zelensky. But I think it is an extraordinary coming together. You couldn't have conceived it 10 days ago. But now the diary has produced a coming together and an ability not to be hobnobbing, but actually to be having one-to-one bilateral discussions in different tents at different times, building relationships. And that's what diplomacy is about.
But it would have been, I think, the timing was set, but I think it would have been a very different experience if Rishi Sunak had still been Prime Minister.
It would, yeah.
Always giving the impression that he would rather be somewhere else. I mean, I can't...
And very often indeed was.
Exactly.
But he called the election. July the 4th. It's his problem. And, Starmer has benefited from it. I think the UK will benefit, particularly when it comes to from the Human Rights Convention and other things, the reassurance of where Britain now stands in Europe on security, political and other issues. I think there will be a warming of relations in a way which you could not have done just through officials in embassies and certainly in Europe. I think this is now an important moment for Britain making clear where it wants to go. It's maybe not the kind of thing that Lord Frost and others might want for Britain in the community, but it's a broader community with a small c, not the capital C. It's an ad hoc arrangement, and as such, it's extraordinary.
And Daniela, is though that gathering of all of Europe, and it is, to be clear, that's the idea of it. It's not just the EU, it's not just NATO, it's
exactly.
or either or both, it's everybody. But is that especially important now, given what is occurring on the Atlantic's other shore? Because certainly at the NATO summit in Washington, D.C. last week, which I was at, as will be emphasised again at the end of the show, this was all anybody was talking about, is like, how long can we rely on America, whoever wins this election?
No, absolutely. And as Nick said, this is about the Labour government also setting out its policy agenda and also Starmer positioning himself and his team as operating at the highest levels of geopolitics, really with a global outlook, both for Britain's self-interest, but also I think they've adopted the policy of progressive realism. I think that's how...
this is David Lammy's idea.
That's how he terms is from, which, to be fair, could mean anything and almost does. But the importance, it's drawing a line in the sand from the Conservatives who were not taken seriously on the world stage, who seemed not to be able to know which way to turn, gaffe-prone, and actually a good bit of British statesmanship behaviour, which I think is going to play very well at home as well.
But this is about unity. This is about a projection of unity at a time when it looks more likely that Trump will become the next president in the United States. And looking at Putin, looking at Xi Jinping as well in China, saying we are united as Europe. We are acting as one, even if we have some internal differences. Don't get the idea that you can split us off and weaken us as a result. And this is an important statement, literally 3 months before the US election.
Well, here in the UK, meanwhile, the wisdom of the decision made by its voters 2 weeks ago has been upheld somewhat by the release of the first report by the inquiry into the then government's handling of the COVID-19 pandemic. To the surprise of nobody with a memory stretching back 4 years, the report is not something with which many recently unseated government MPs will be burnishing their resumes. It says in sum that the UK planned for the wrong pandemic, specifically of one of those milder viruses which everyone would probably get, but what are you going to do? As it was, more lives and money were lost than should have been. Contributing factors included group-thinking boffins and incurious ministers. Daniela, first of all, I mean, this is obviously by definition, in hindsight, in retrospect, that's the point, I guess, of investigations. What didn't we know that we should have known? But are you astonished by how, well, actually pretty damning this has been?
There are no ladders to climb down, really. There's nowhere to hide. I mean, this is being handed on a plate to Keir Starmer. This is a product of the planning of a deeply embedded Conservative government. It's you don't even need to play the blame game here. It's just falling into his lap. But I think also it speaks to me of something very British, really, which is this kind of inequality, really, which is, boffins, and not the experts that we were warned against, but people sequestered in academia or the civil service making decisions, regardless, and not really connected with what people and wider communities were experiencing. And certainly we saw that to such stark effect in the pandemic, how it had a different impact on different communities, on ethnic minorities, on people in different socioeconomic situations. And yeah, it's easy to look at this in retrospect, but we weren't the only country going through the pandemic. And I think that's crucial to look at how perhaps in more equal, more meritocratic societies, where there was a greater level of public debate and accountability, how they managed. Some countries did worse, it's true, but I don't think we have. I don't think we've got a great deal to be complacent about.
Nick, an aspect of the government's handling which did perturb me at the time was why this country did not make the most of its one obvious natural advantage, i.e. the fact of it being an island, much the more so with a government which had been elected on a promise to restore our sovereignty and, fix our borders, and you had all the excuse in the world to hoist the drawbridges. Some island countries did, Australia, New Zealand, Taiwan, among others. The United Kingdom didn't.
Remember, though, Andrew, all of us travel by plane, we travel by boat. We mix. And if we'd literally pulled up the drawbridges and shut ourselves off, that would have been sending a very serious message. And certainly Boris Johnson, as Prime Minister, didn't want to do that. But can I just underline something I think far more fundamental? It comes from Baroness Hallett, the inquiry chair. The UK was ill prepared for dealing with a catastrophic emergency, let alone the coronavirus pandemic. And let me tell you, as someone who's been involved in resilience and risk for a long time, this is indicative of a country which is deeply vulnerable, not just to COVID, but also to the Russian threat. And that's what the new defence review, to be chaired by George...
It's not springing to my mind either.
The former Defence Secretary. George Robertson. Which will report next year. That's what this is about. It's about security. It's about the security and the ability of a country to defend itself and provide security. Because at the same time as this, we had yesterday the report of the London Resilience Review talking about the need to raise banks and river protection by at least 50 centimetres because of what's coming down the track. And I put to you that this is what has emerged from the COVID inquiry. It is that actually this country was complacent about thinking about what the risks really were. 900 civil servants were brought together to look at what would happen if there was a flu epidemic. They were not able to actually then extend that into preparing for a coronavirus simply because of one thing. They didn't want to spend the money. And they didn't want to show political weakness. And that's what Baroness Hallett says. She said, were ill-prepared for dealing with a catastrophic emergency. The Civil Contingencies Secretariat was abolished a few years ago. We are not prepared at a time when certainly the former Chief of the General Staff, the former head of the Army, Patrick Saunders, said very clearly in an interview with the Times a couple of weeks ago, he said, we don't have any ammunition, we're not ready for a war, we could probably survive for about a month. So there's a much bigger issue than what happened in COVID. It's about the culture of government and the culture particularly of secretaries of state in what they do and how they respond to what they're being told by experts about the vulnerability. They eventually, as political masters, did not want to do what was necessary because it wasn't seen the right thing to do, even though the warning had been there that we were heading for something really quite nasty.
Daniela, there's one, I think, eternal inbuilt failing of democratic governments, which is they don't like spending time and money on things which either might not happen at all or might not happen for a long time, and if they do, they won't get any credit for them. But is there also, do you think, have we learnt from this, and might we glean from the 8 further reports which are still to follow, a bit of a criticism of what does strike me, and I say this with all due respect and affection, of a somewhat specifically British attitude to the effect of, it'll be fine, we'll muddle through this somehow?
keep calm and carry on, which is really the death of any kind of sort of resilience. No, I think that's an issue, and I think also resilient societies tend to be more equal societies where there's the ability and opportunity are more equally spread. If you have, again, it's the civil servants in their silos thinking, well, we're going to tick this box, but we're not really going to listen to things that are outside our remit. And also, Brexit also took up quite a lot of...
The report does mention this.
Yeah. That sort of, sucked out quite a lot of the oxygen in the room for, the years...
An apt metaphor.
Preceding. Ouch. Yeah. And also, I think what's particularly British as well is just how... Not just that the response was mismanaged, and I'm not saying there shouldn't have been a debate between should we lock down, should we think about the economy, or should we think about saving lives, but it was the way in which the Boris Johnson government was later found to have been partying away, and was just so distanced from people, and so I think it did a lot to shake faith in government and process, and that's what civil servants and that's what government needs to do. It needs to do a lot of stuff, as you said, to prepare for contingencies that might not happen, that might happen. But, to be prepared, it's not glamorous and it's slightly thankless, but that is literally their job.
But I know a lot of civil servants who are frustrated. They said this government should be acting much more decisively, in a much more determined way. And they were kind of metaphorically tearing their hair out because they were not being listened to. And one of the things that Baroness Hallett says is far too much groupthink. But this is exactly the same as you see in any risk and resilience report. There's too much groupthink. There's too much conformity. And remember what was said in the King's speech yesterday, written by and approved by Starmer. He said there will have to be a new candour in the public service. In other words, public servants who are experts should be allowed to speak up without letting their careers just be diminished by speaking up.
Crazy idea. Let's see if it catches on. But we'll look now at Japan, which for reasons surpassing understanding is not merely tolerating but encouraging the use of umbrellas. As any civilised person understands, umbrellas, certainly on crowded urban footpaths, are an accessory of the sociopath who prioritises, indeed, their own dryness ahead of the unpoked eyes and ungouged foreheads of their fellow citizens. Seriously, buy a damn hat and coat. Umbrellas are also an environmental menace, being so often lost or discarded. However, instead of doing the obviously sensible thing and banning umbrellas on pain of the public horsewhipping of their owners, Japanese authorities are permitting the proliferation of umbrella rental services. Daniela, first of all, do I go too far? Should umbrella users be actually flogged or merely lightly tasered?
As long as the punishment doesn't involve the insertion of an actual umbrella.
I'm absolutely fine with that in certain circumstances.
I'm surprised you didn't go there, Andrew. But yeah.
I'm trying to be reasonable.
Okay, fair enough.
Are you an umbrellaist?
I can say proudly that I've never bought an umbrella in my life.
But
I am a mopper-up of umbrellas. I regularly have social events in my home just for the purpose of
You mean you encourage people to leave umbrellas when they
You invite people round on a rainy day so they will bring their umbrellas. You ply them with drinks so they will forget their umbrellas.
I mean, look, this is just inevitable. This is just like the natural way of things. People come to houses when it's raining, they take umbrellas and they leave them there. And it's just the way it's worked out for me over the last couple of decades. A constant supply of umbrellas without having to spend a penny on actual umbrellas. But I feel that when I go to places with said umbrellas, I also forget those umbrellas. And so it's a kind of umbrella ecosystem. I think it's quite sustainable, really.
Notice the status attached to umbrellas, though. When you go to a corporate event, one of the main things they give you these days is an umbrella, because it has the name of the company, and when you put it up, it's a mobile advertising.
And those are always the biggest umbrellas wielded on the footpath by the worst people.
Oh, but I take only the small ones, which are less than a foot long, because then they go inobtrusively into my backpack.
Nick, you're either part of the problem or part of the solution.
No,
here.
But think of the circularity, recycling of these dreadful bits of plastic and wood.
Mm-hmm. But that does bring to the actually serious point here, which is that the Japanese are doing the sensible thing of trying to encourage the sharing economy. And I did want to ask you both in closing. I'll ask you first, Daniela. Have you ever participated? Let's not count things like, taxis or ride sharing because that's fairly standard. But have you participated in any sort of neighbourhood scheme in which you can borrow other people's stuff? Or anything like that?
Legally?
Ideally legally?
Oh, I have to think again. I live in a block of flats, and just yesterday I gave the downstairs neighbour some child's toys that I was no longer using, some bubble blowing equipment. It was all very...
You're a bit old for that, aren't you?
Yeah, right. Okay. Yeah, but I think that's quite standard. Even in unfriendly London, we leave things down by the bins that either are magically shared, reused, or thrown away.
This doesn't involve an app of any sort, though.
It doesn't involve an app, and it's one step on from sort of leaving a broken down dishwasher in your front garden. But it's natural. It's natural sharing economy. Then what your neighbours don't want, there are always charity shops.
What about you, Nick?
Look, our private cars tend to be used only 2% of the time.
Mm-hmm.
They sit around as bits of metal and plastic, unused. We are very bad at realising the enormity of the disposability which we could create. And remember, if you go down the street, the number of people who've got a drill,
mm-hmm.
A circular saw, a lawnmower, all that is only used probably for 2% of the time, if that. Much of it could be shared. We could do B&Q out of business by telling them that having not just ride sharing, but tool sharing and brolly sharing and everything sharing, we could sort of undermine the retail sector by saying much of what you use, actually you don't need to have full time.
Well, on that demented call for communist revolution, Nick Gowing and I
didn't call for revolution.
I hope we're not talking to B&Q about sponsorship. If we were, we're not now. Nick Gowing and Daniela Pellard, thank you both for joining us. Finally, on today's show, our weekly letter from is a letter from me, you lucky people, where I was last week, i.e. Washington. For obvious reasons, this last decade or so has been a challenging one to be an Americophile abroad. It has also been difficult for this particular Americophile abroad for more personal reasons, in that I hadn't actually been to America for more than a decade. So I was curious to see if returning, as I did last week, would seem as exciting as it always had. There was a time during which I went to the United States a lot. I started out in journalism as a rock writer, mostly for the British Music Weekly Melody Maker, and spent a decent chunk of the 1990s clowning around the US in the company of various rock groups. It was, in several respects, a ridiculous way to see America, and in many more, a perfect one. You met a lot more Americans and saw a lot more of America than you would if you only visited the big cities as a box-ticking tourist. More than once, when someone has asked me for my own US-related travel recommendations, I've suggested they throw a few darts at the map, not least as I often suspected this was how someone was devising my own itineraries. And I adored the place, its mad energy, its glorious stories, the hospitality and courtesy of its people, who, usefully for a journalist, you just could not shut up.
Just roll me up and smoke one eye.
But I hadn't been to America for more than a decade since, I think, interviewing Willie Nelson in New York in 2011 or something, but basically not since the music business ran out of money, possibly because it was spending so much of it sending me back and forth to America. So I was excited to return last week, even if it was to a city assessed by one resident, specifically President John F. Kennedy, as inverting America's internal stereotypes and demonstrating Southern efficiency and Northern charm, the capital, Washington, D.C. I didn't have much spare time on this visit. Duty compelled me to spend most of my daylight hours in D.C. confined, like other NATO summit press, to a vast windowless barn within the summit venue, air-conditioned to the point that Ernest Shackleton would have knitted himself another balaclava. So I decided to reconnect by embracing the role of box-ticking tourist at what I already knew to be two of my favourite museums, both on the Mall, the National Museum of American History and the National Air and Space Museum. The National Museum of American History is essentially America's attic, a trove of stuff perhaps no longer strictly useful, but which nobody can bring themselves to throw away. Ulysses Grant's binoculars, Harry Truman's overcoat, George Custer's fringed buckskin jacket, the top hat Abraham Lincoln wore on an ill-advised outing to the theatre, the actual whites-only lunch counter at which 4 astonishingly brave black students sat in Greensboro, North Carolina in 1960. You can stand on a section of Woodstock stage and photograph a case containing Eddie Van Halen's guitar and John Coltrane's saxophone. It is difficult, I submit, not to emerge somewhat agog at the country which can furnish all that, and so very much more besides. The National Air and Space Museum on the Mall is not, to be honest, really the cool bit. The really cool bit is its annex, the Udvar-Hazy Centre out near Dulles Airport, a vast and astonishing collection of aircraft where you can see, as I had before, an entire space shuttle, specifically Discovery, the beautiful Lockheed SR-71 Blackbird, the fastest ever crewed jet aircraft which evaded enemy missiles by outrunning them, and Enola Gay, the B-29 which destroyed Hiroshima and whose pilot I once met in one of those peculiar encounters which only seem to occur in America, but that's another story. The National Air and Space Museum on the Mall does, however, contain the two artefacts which, between them, demonstrate the audacity, optimism and enterprise of the US at its best. One is the Wright Flyer, the galumphing contraption with which Wilbur and Orville Wright, bicycle repairmen from Ohio, launched the age of aviation in 1903. The other, just a few metres away, is Columbia, the Apollo 11 command module, in which Neil Armstrong, Buzz Aldrin and Michael Collins returned to Earth after visiting the Moon 66 years later. There was at least one generation of Americans who could have read of both events in their morning newspaper. In the National Air and Space Museum shop, I pick up a coffee mug emblazoned with the admonishment,
"Failure is not an option."
The line is attributed to NASA Chief Flight Director Gene Kranz amid the frantic efforts to bring home the stricken Apollo 13 module. Kranz never said it, though. The line was spoken by Ed Harris playing Kranz in Apollo 13, the film. There is, I think, something definitively American about this cheerful confabulation of fact and myth. Upstairs in the museum there's a huge model of an X-Wing fighter from Star Wars. I overhear a guide telling her group that she often has to explain that it isn't real. For Monocle Radio, I'm Andrew Muller. And that is all for this edition of The Daily. Thanks to our panellists today, Daniela Peled and Nick Gowing. Today's show was produced by Henry Rhys Sheridan and researched by Gunnar Grunlid and Sana Jumani. Our sound engineer was Sarah Nichol. I'm Andrew Muller here in London. The Daily is back at the same time tomorrow. Thanks for listening.